Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have Dr. Ali Safavi. We'll be discussing with him a topic that's becoming increasingly on the radar, which is Iran's targeting of opposition and dissidents living abroad in the diaspora, particularly in Europe. There's a growing number of stories about incidents of harassment, pressure, stalking, and even violent attacks against expats from Iran in various countries. We've heard a lot about IRGC being present in Turkey, but even in London, Germany, and other countries, this phenomenon persists, and we are going to discuss why that is the case, why the European governments continue to tolerate it, and what can be done to protect the vulnerable from the regime's methods. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I understand that you live in Europe as well.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Irina. I'm based in Paris.
Mm-hmm. So over the past several years, there's been numerous incidents involving Iranian plots, including a planned attack on the opposition that was foiled, but also ultimately resulted in uncovering major networks of Iranian diplomats involved in masterminding what can only be described as terrorism. Nevertheless, none of that has been fully resolved even recently. So what I want to start with, though, before we get to the reaction of the European authorities, is how has the Iranian state adapted its methods of repression to operate effectively beyond its own borders, especially in European democracies that that are essentially primed to withstand a great deal of external pressure?
Well, I think there are two ways of responding to this. One is to get into, if you will, the mechanics of this intimidation, harassment, and terrorism, which I will discuss. But as to how the regime has been so successful in doing this, far from being an intelligence issue, it's a political issue, which means that when European governments, in pursuit of whether it is economic interest or political concessions, keep their guards down, their political guards down, then the regime makes inroads. And of course, in Europe, as I'm sure you know, generally speaking, Western countries, it's an open society. And so if a nefarious actor is sophisticated enough, they can employ various methods to get what they intend to do. Now, when it comes to the case of the Iranian regime, they use outright harassment, intimidation through various means available to them. They engage in recruiting foreign nationals, macro mafia gangs, organized crime gangs, to carry out their terrorist plots. They use intimidation by reaching out to members of the Iranian diaspora, warning them against engaging in activities which they view as being against the state. They, of course, engage in kidnappings, in terrorist attacks, one of which, of course, was the famous terrorist plot against the Free Iran World Summit in 2018, in June, in Paris, which, of course, was thwarted at the last minute by European intelligence services, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and France. And God forbid, had that been a successful one, thousands would have been killed, including not only the leadership of the organized opposition, Mrs. Rajavi, where terrorists were told to put the explosive as close to where she was sitting as possible, which was in the VIP section, but also hundreds of international dignitaries from the US and Europe. So the regime deploys various methods to pressure Iranian diaspora not to engage in activities that are against the mullahs.
It's interesting that you noticed that you noted that international dignitaries were present at that summit. It seems that Iran doesn't seem to care that it could also literally wound, injure, or kill European or American leaders. Why do you suppose it is not concerned about the consequences of what would basically amount to an act of war?
Well, I guess, in the case of Vilipant, that was an unsuccessful attempt. The terrorists were identified and arrested, and a senior Iranian regime diplomat who was the station chief for Iranian intelligence ministry in the whole of Europe was also apprehended, plus a third person. But when it comes to brazenness of these attacks, as you say, the regime holds nothing back. In just 2 years ago, in November 9, 2023, a very renowned European politician, vice president of the European Parliament for 15 years, Professor Alejo Vidal Quadras, was shot at point blank range as he was walking from a walk in the park to his home. Luckily, he turned his head slightly, and the bullet pierced his jaw, entering from the right and exiting from the left, but he survived. And the gunman escaped by riding on a scooter. 8 people were apprehended by the Dutch, the Spanish, and other intelligence services, and they are now awaiting trial in January. And the investigative judge, in the indictment that he issued, said that this is all linked to the Iranian regime, which had this time organized or hired the services of macro mafia. All of the 8 were foreign nationals, including Tunisian, French, Moroccans, and the mastermind of the attack escaped to Iran. So 8 are in detention, 1 remains out, a fugitive. Now, naturally, what did the Europeans do? Nothing more than a slap on the back of the hand, basically imposing some sanctions on some intelligence directorate of the Iranian regime's Ministry of Intelligence, Department 312, which is responsible for internal security, but nothing more than that. Of course, one would have expected for Europe, for the European Union, to expel Iranian diplomats, to shut down the Iranian regime's embassies, and to recall its ambassadors. But none of that happened. And so when you ask, why isn't the regime afraid of consequences? It isn't. Because Europeans in all these years haven't done anything commensurate with the kind of terrorist activities that have been carried out by the Iranian regime. Just since the 1990s, there have been several high-profile dissidents assassinated. In 1989, the head of the Iranian Kurdish group, Dr. Abdurrahman Qasemlu, was assassinated at point in Vienna, Austria. In 1990, Ambassador Kazem Rajavi, the NCR representative in Switzerland, was shot and killed by 13 terrorists who had come to Geneva by direct flight from Tehran. And they, after carrying out the attack, they left without a trace back to Iran. All of them were carrying service passports issued by the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Then in 1992, one Iranian dissident was kidnapped in Istanbul Ali Akbar Qurbani, who was working on behalf of the Mujahideen Khalq in Turkey. His mutilated body was found a few months later in a shallow grave near Istanbul. In 1993, the representative of the NCRI in Rome, Mohammad Hossein Naqvi, was shot in broad daylight as he was driving home in Rome. And then in 1996, the representative of the NCRI for the rights of refugees in Istanbul, a lady, was shot along with her colleague in that city. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And, in the famous Mykonos assassination in Berlin, where 4 Kurdish dissidents were killed, and the court in 1997 concluded that the Iranian regime leadership, from the Supreme Leader Khamenei to Foreign Minister at the time of the attack, Velayati, and a whole host of others, were involved in these attacks. But as we know, Europe really hasn't done anything to hold the mullahs regime accountable, which explain why they have become more and more brazen in recent years. And of course, the Vilipand attack and the attack on Mr. Quadras were not the only cases. In March of 2018, the regime planted a car bombing of a New Year celebration that the Mujahideen Khalq MEK were hosting in Tirana. And at that meeting, several high-profile American and European personalities were present, including Ambassador John Bolton. And that truck bombing was luckily neutralized at the last minute by Albanian authorities. And to their credit, of course, Albania expelled the Iranian ambassador from that country. And actually, he was the station chief for Iranian Ministry of Intelligence in Europe before being assigned to Albania. And Asadullah Assadi, the one who masterminded the Paris plot, replaced him.
So from this, we learned 2 things. There's a pattern of using undercover intelligence officials as diplomats, and who are then involved in terrorist plots all over Europe. And the second, there seems to be no serious political repercussions after this happens, certainly not to the country as a whole. Do you suppose that European governments have sort of a quiet understanding with the Iranian regime that so long as they don't target mass plots of, regular quote-unquote Europeans, like the way ISIS, for instance, did, so long as they mostly focus on opposition gatherings, that will be tolerated and the reaction will be limited? Is there some sort of a tacit political arrangement of that sort?
I doubt that is the case. If you recall, after the Mykonos assassinations in Berlin, the European Union recalled its ambassadors for a few months and basically said that the regime's emissaries were persona non grata. And in April of 1997, the European Union issued a statement basically calling on the identification, apprehension, and expulsion of Iranian intelligence agents from Europe. And for a time, the Iranian regime basically kept a low profile, knowing that it was costly for it to engage in such activities, especially since, if you remember, at that time, so-called moderate president Mohammad Khatami was the Iranian president. He was talking about dialogue between civilizations and things of that nature. And so for a while, the mullahs kept a very low profile in Europe. But, of course, as the situation inside Iran is beginning to deteriorate, as the regime is facing a multitude of crises economically, politically, regionally and internationally, given, for example, the fact that there have been 6-7 major uprisings in Iran since 2017, with the latest back in 2022, and then you had the decapitation of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the 12-day war, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Iranian economy in a free fall, the Iranian currency losing literally all of its value, is not even worth the paper it's being printed on. And of course, continuing protests since 2022 have made the situation of the regime very precarious, which explains why it has now again resorted to actions that intimidate Iranian dissidents. Just for you to know, when it comes to Germany, there have been 90 or so Iranian nationals who are active one way or the other with the Iranian opposition, who have been warned by Iranian authorities through WhatsApp messages, through telephone calls, through emails, that, we're watching you, and some of them have had their family members summoned to Iranian intelligence ministry in Iran and have been told to tell the children not to engage in political activities. So as the situation for the regime becomes more and more precarious, and as the organized opposition gains more and more momentum, both inside Iran and on the international stage, naturally the mullahs feel compelled to engage in such activities. Remember that when this regime came to power back in 1979, it relied on three pillars. One, the pursuit of nuclear weapons program. Two, exporting its extremist ideology to the regions around the world under the rubric of exporting revolution. And of course, you saw in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, all over the region, they were heavily involved. And of course, they tried to advance the nuclear program, hiding it from the international community. But fortunately, given the efforts of the NCRI, that program was exposed. And so when it comes to the nuclear side of things, they have suffered seriously. And now, of course, with the bombing of Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan, it seems that the nuclear program has been to some extent set back. And of course, with the fall of Assad and the whole change in geopolitics of the region, that pillar has also been weakened. So what they have now doing is inside Iran, stepping up executions, and outside Iran, trying to intimidate and terrorize Iranian dissidents, Iranian members of the diaspora, because they have become more energized, more active every day. They have protests all over in Europe, in the US. And so this explains why you see an uptick in Iranian harassment of Iranian dissidents abroad.
No, of course, Iran is not the only authoritarian regime that engages in diaspora intimidation. We have seen Russia attempt, and in some cases succeed, in assassinations on foreign soil. We have seen China abduct opposition members and critics and engage in fake police stations all over the world, including in the United States. Is there anything that makes Iranian tactics different from others who engage in similar, in this sort of activities?
Well, obviously, I cannot speak to what other, as you say, authoritarian regimes are doing, but what I can say about the regime in Tehran is that they are, one, as brazen as it can get. They don't fear any kind of repercussions, because for them, really, it's the issue of survival. And for them, the organized Iranian opposition, the National Council of Resistance, the Mujahideen Khalq, are perceived as an existential threat. So they would go at any length to try to harm this movement. Secondly, they are very sophisticated, and they employ an assortment of tactics. I mentioned how Iranian intelligence agents message members of the diaspora, Iranian diaspora abroad, saying that we are watching you, we know what you do, and things of that sort. But also what they do, they have their agents all over Europe as well. You know, when Asatollah Assadi was arrested by German police very close to the Austrian border, they recovered a green book from him that contained the names of hundreds of agents that Assadi had employed throughout Europe, a lot of them in Germany, and there were receipts of regular payments, 500 euros, 1,000 euros, 1,500 euros to all these agents. So in addition to the work of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence inside Iran, the harassment of families of Iranians abroad, they also have agents on European soil with this precise task also in the US. Just to give you an idea, back in August of 2018, the FBI and the Department of Justice unsealed an indictment where two Iranian intelligence agents, one of them a US citizen, were caught in an operation which the FBI described as a capture-kill operation. And there were the names of several Iranian dissidents in the indictment that the Iranian intelligence had captured, and one of them was my name, plus my colleague at the U.S. Representative Office in Washington, because I'm based in Washington, although right now I'm in Europe. And so they had surveilled us, and they had taken lots of pictures of us. They had probably some plot to kidnap us and perhaps take us to Iran or a third country. And so in addition to their agents abroad, they also have a series of talking heads, if you will, so-called academics, even journalists, who try to engage in a smear campaign, write negative articles, trying to, if you will, stigmatize the opposition so that when some terrorist attack occurs, it is justified, and you don't see much reaction on the part of the international community, on the part of Europeans, saying that, well, these folks who were targeted, they were bad guys themselves. So the regime deploys an assortment of tactics, and they are very adept at it. This is their business. For them, assassination, kidnapping, killing, hostage taking has become a very lucrative and very, very sophisticated, if you will, kind of work. It has almost become industrialized. We all know that whenever an Iranian agent is caught red-handed, like the case of Assadi or that criminal in Sweden who was involved in the 1988 massacre and sentenced to life imprisonment, the Iranian regime went and took two diplomats hostage, one a Swedish diplomat, and to secure the release of that war criminal Hamid Nouri. And then in the case of Belgium, they arrested a Belgian aid worker, Olivier van der Kassel, and that secured the release of Assadollah Assadi, who served 5 years of his 20-year sentence in prison in Belgium. So you can clearly see that when it comes to harassment, when it comes to terrorism against Iranian dissidents and even against European nationals, there is nothing that the regime has not left unused. They use every tactic, and as such, they are deservedly been designated as the most active state sponsor of terrorism around the world, more than any other country.
Now, with the European governments aware that Iran routinely uses high-level intelligence operatives under diplomatic cover and terrorists under diplomatic cover, why have they given credentials to these people instead of demanding that somebody else takes the spot if they must have diplomatic relations with that country?
I think that's a question they really have to answer for. But unfortunately, as you and I know, in a lot of ways in today's world, in the world of diplomacy, on many occasions, and not just terrorism, even the situation of human rights in Iran, Western governments close their eyes and they offer concessions. As you know, for a long time, the Europeans, and for that matter, the American administration, under Obama and, of course, under Biden, were trying to reach some sort of a deal regarding Iran's nuclear weapons program. And to achieve that outcome, they closed their eyes on all the other sinister, malign activities. Is an issue, for example, with the number of executions in Iran, which has gone through the roof. They will say, well, why don't we resolve the nuclear issue first, and then we will address the issue of human rights in Iran. Whenever people talked about the regime's support for Bashar al-Assad and the killings of 500,000 Syrian citizens in the course of the war there, they would say, well, that's an issue we will address after the nuclear problem is resolved. But as we know, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, did not resolve the nuclear issue. The regime cheated and deceived and engaged in duplicity and advanced its nuclear weapons program. And it continued its other activities. And now, as we speak, last time I checked, the number of executions in Iran just in 2025 is 2,115, which is more than double 2024. And the number of executions under the new president, which the West dubs as a moderate, Masoud Pezeshkian, more than 2,760 have been hanged, including 63 women. So clearly, I think Western Europeans have sacrificed their values for which millions of Europeans gave their lives in the interest of some diplomatic, if you will, some concessions from the regime in Tehran. But of course, now, given that it has become apparent for them that this regime will not moderate its behavior, will not abide by its obligations internationally, whether it is the issue of non-proliferation, whether it's the issue of terrorism, whether it's the issue of human rights, that they should try to impose tougher measures against the regime. They've done it vis-a-vis the nuclear program, but not about the other issues that I raised.
Now, seems to me that there's something a little bit strange going on. As you've pointed out, Iran is a very poor country. Its economy is in shambles. There's a high degree of business risk involved with doing any sort of transactions with such a state. Not only that, but it's sending, horrific terrorists and intelligence officers as diplomats. In other words, it's a dangerous country to deal with, whether diplomatically or economically. What value does continuation of relations with Iran provide to European countries? China, you can at least say they produce a lot of stuff. It's an unhealthy economic dependency, but it's there. What's the value of Iran in this respect? Its GDP is a fraction of China and so on.
That's a very good question, I think. I believe that the Europeans still continue to believe that the regime in Tehran is a permanent feature of the Middle East. And for them, they say, well, what if the situation gets worse after this regime is overthrown? Then what are we going to do? They have the experience of Iraq, where the government there was toppled. They have the experience of Libya. As you know, the European Union was heavily involved in the situation in Libya. And then, of course, you had the situation in Syria. But I think the mistake that they are making, and this is a mistake of historic proportions, is that unlike Iraq, unlike Libya, unlike Syria, Iran is the one country in the Middle East where you have a nation state, is one of the two nation states in that part of the world, Egypt being the second. Two, it has the most educated population, or perhaps one of the most educated populations in the world and in the region. It has one of the youngest populations in the Middle East. I think 70% or so live below 35 years of age. It has is a nation state. It's not a construct of colonial times when, after the Balfour Declaration, the British took out the pen and drew the maps of some of the countries in the region. Iran has a civilization of some 3,000 years. And of course, it has seen four major revolutions, the 1906 revolution, the government of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, then you had the 1979 revolution, and of course now you have a brewing revolution as we speak inside Iran, which despite all the killings, all the repression the regime has faced to quash. And more than that, unlike Libya, unlike Iraq, unlike Syria, you have an organized alternative that has a network both within Iran in the form of thousands of resistance units, but also has a recognizable leader. Mrs. Rajavi has a specific plan for the future, the 10-point plan, which enjoys the support of some 4,000 parliamentarians, bipartisan parliamentarians around the world, including majorities in at least 34 legislatures. It has the support of some 18 Nobel laureates, and of course, many former senior US government officials, heads of states, prime ministers, ministers, you name it. And so in this sense, quite frankly, we believe that it is high time for the European Union to invest in the Iranian people, in the future of Iran, not on the current regime. After all, the policy for the past 46 years has been a dismal failure. What has it brought? Instability in the Middle East, the threat of proliferation in the entire region, and of course, horrifying and shocking number of executions of Iranian citizens every day. And, there are now at least 18 members of the 18 dissidents charged with affiliation with the MEK are on death row, including a 67-year-old woman, Zahra Tabari, which just 2 days ago, some 400 distinguished women around the world issued a statement in her support. So clearly, I think the European Union should revise and rethink its policy vis-a-vis Iran, and be bold enough to look to the future of that country, and, as I said, reach out to the people of Iran and to the organized opposition. Now, interestingly, as I'm sure you know, unlike other countries, our movement is not asking for boots on the ground. It is not asking for the European Union, for the Western world, to hold the Iranian regime officials accountable, to make relations with them conditional upon an end to executions and torture of Iranian people.
Now, the European geopolitical logic fails in another regard, which is to say, even if they're afraid of regime collapse or some sort of a civil war breaking out or what have you, that does not require European involvement, just requires European distancing from Iran to at least protect their own interests. Let's look at the example of North Korea, which was for a very long time far more isolated than it is now, and the regime has not collapsed. Major war activities did not break out anywhere, and at the very least, Europe for a while was protected against some of the North Korean activities. And the more accepted North Korea has become internationally, the more it has engaged in disruptive behavior, engaging with more and more terrorists, cyber attacks, and so forth. So the logic dictates that even if you don't want to intervene in Iran in any way, or if you want to preserve the status quo to some extent, even then, the current course of action is not helpful because it allows Iran to intervene in European affairs. So this is what I don't understand. Again, there isn't a great deal of economic value coming in from Iran's relations with these European countries, and certainly not something that cannot be recouped with increased engagement with other states around the world. So my question is then, is it a matter of corruption? Are there deals that are being signed under the radar that benefit particularly European interests that we are just that are not part of the generic economic calculus? Is there something going on that level that we just don't see?
Well, to be honest, it's difficult to say, but there's no question that the Europeans have benefited from this regime staying in power. Why? Because it offers them cheap oil. You know, if for the Iranian regime to find market, it has to offer its oil at deep discounts. It also imports a lot of goods within the country. Remember that the French, the Germans, and the Italians were largest trade partners of Iran for a long, long time. And it is only recently that because of regime's nuclear intransigence, they activated the snapback mechanism, reinstating the Sixth Security Council resolution, which imposes sanctions on the regime. Now, obviously, as you say, the mullahs over the past 46 years have cultivated ties, probably with people in Europe. I'm sure you know every day now you had this case of Federica Mogherini involved in a massive corruption at the European Union level. And before her, there was the issue of Qatargate. There were some other Iranians, like this so-called Iranian expert in Germany. I guess his name was Babak Tabatabai, who was a senior advisor to the German Foreign Ministry and received $2 million from the German Adnan Tabatabai, I'm sorry, from German Foreign Ministry to engage in so-called research, but he was in fact he was being directed by the Iranian Foreign Ministry, as were several other accomplices. It was called Iran Expert Initiative that spanned all over, the world, including in the United States, where a so-called Harvard-educated scholar, Aryan Tabatabai, was working with the Iranian Foreign Ministry. So yes, you're correct that all these years, 47 years of working with the regime, trying to appease it, trying to offer it concessions, perhaps this is what explains the lack of action on the part of the European Union. But of course, there's a lot of economic interest as well involved. I have no doubt about that, because come tomorrow, when Iran has a government, again, a democratic government, when Iranian can attain self-determination, that they would want a relationship with the rest of the world on an equal footing and based upon mutual respect. And let's hope that the Europeans are prepared to accept something like that.
Now, to what extent does Iran rely on formal intelligence services versus informal networks, such as cultural centers, religious institutions, or, as you've mentioned previously, criminal intermediaries? How much of what we are seeing in terms of espionage and intimidation tactics and surveillance is, formal, intelligence activity versus these, agents, paid agents?
That's a very good question. As I told you, the mullahs have a lot of items in their toolkit, and one of them, as you say, is using so-called cultural centers, religious centers to advance their agenda. They had a big operation in Albania. They engaged in translating a lot of Albanian books, Iranian books into Albanian, and they all of a sudden became interested in Albanian culture. Now, Albania doesn't even have an embassy in Iran. And of course, that was designed to influence Albanian society because the MEK was in Albania. They also had similar kind of institutions in Germany, the Hamburg Mosque, which was a center for recruiting extremists. And of course, the German government shut it down. There were many centers in Germany that were shut down. They had similar centers in the United States, in Texas, in Michigan, other parts of the US, where they had these seemingly cultural associations, which were in fact, if you will, nests for recruitment and indoctrination and extremism. So they deploy, as I said, a variety of means and capabilities to spread their ideas around the world and brainwash unsuspecting individuals. For example, they had this elementary school for young children in Houston, Texas, where they were, the girls were chanting, "Hello, Commander," meaning Ali Khamenei, who's so-called the commander-in-chief of Iranian armed forces. So yes, they do use non-official, under the radar, seemingly benign cultural societies and cultural activities with the ultimate aim of recruiting agents. They also invite a lot of foreigners to Iran to teach them. There's this famous university, Al-Mustafa University, which has branches all over the world. And there's, a huge budget, and that is the task of recruitment, education, and training of terrorists abroad. And of course, as I said, many of them go to Iran. Some time ago, in Washington, we revealed the name of 14 different terrorist training camps of the Iranian regime in various parts of Iran, where they would take foreign nationals and train them in all kinds of tactics, both terrorist attacks, commando type activities, but also offer them some sort of educational background. So when they go back to their respective countries, they will try to recruit the nationals of their own countries. They also use ICRC. For example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Iranian regime used ICR, it's Red Cross, the Red Crescent in that country, under so-called humanitarian activities, but was actually involved in terrorist recruitment. And I remember some time ago, it was revealed that they had even imported a lot of toys, which were in fact explosive devices into that country. So yes, the mullahs use everything and anything to try to promote and expand and spread their extremist ideology outside of Iran, because for them, philosophically, because this is a regressive regime, because this regime doesn't belong to the 20th century, it needs to expand itself. Many, many years ago, Muhammad Khatami, who became the president in 1997, said, if we do not engage in expansion, the Farsi word is bast, we will suffocate from within because we have nothing to offer to our own people. And so now you see them, why for them the export of terrorism and extremism has become the number one priority. After all, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps doesn't even have the name of Iran in it, as you can see. It is basically the extraterritorial arm of the Iranian regime.
Now, We know that in addition to using all these methods, the regime tries to use family ties against the diaspora, basically by threatening families inside Iran with torture, arrests, and harassment and restrictions to keep people from being engaging in activism abroad. And the other issue, of course, they use dual national as political hostages because they know that many people have strong family connections and they travel back to Iran to visit their family members. Is there anything that can be done by the European states to protect people from having their families used as weapons? And what can the diaspora members do to avoid being intimidated in such a way? After all, not everybody can take their entire families with them when they leave, but at the same time, if this is what regime is going to do, how can people not be concerned about their own, elderly parents, siblings, and so forth?
Excuse me. You know that our experience in all these years in dealing with this regime has proven that the mullahs understand only the language of firmness.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Europeans must change their approach.
Mm-hmm.
They must hold the regime accountable.
Mm-hmm.
They should, for example, shut down the regime's embassies in Europe. The regime's embassies in Europe are not diplomatic centers.
Mm-hmm.
They are hubs for espionage, for intelligence gathering, and for terrorism and harassment. As you said yourself, many Iranian regime diplomats are in fact agents of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence. In fact, in the height of the factional infighting, Javad Zarif said on television that our diplomacy is run by the security services. So in that sense, you're not talking about a normal regime, and you're not talking about normal embassies like embassies of other countries. And so there's a lot that Europe can do, but they refuse to do it. Yes, statements of condemnation and things like that are very good, but they're not enough. Concrete actions need to be taken. For example, Iranian regime officials must be banned from traveling to the Western capitals. Why is the Iranian regime president allowed to visit the UN Security General Assembly session? Why is he given the podium to speak?
Mm-hmm.
The Iranian regime is the #1 per capita executioner of its own citizens, even more than China.
Mm-hmm.
The Iranian regime is the leading executioner of its own of women, is the only executioner of children. Why are Europeans receiving Iranian regime diplomats? So there is a lot that Europe can do, as it did with other countries. There are many other countries who do not have a good record, and Europeans are very tough on them. But with the regime in Iran, you don't see that. So I think that if the Europeans take a tough stand, if, for example, the UN Security Council adopts a resolution condemning Iran's atrocious human rights dossier, things will be different. After all, how can you explain that for 37 years, the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in 1988 was unaddressed by the UN system? It is only this year that a reference is made to the 1988 massacre in the UN General Assembly resolution that condemned the human rights situation in Iran. So yes, there are many, many means available to the European Union to force the regime to stop harassment of Iranian families inside Iran and harassment and threats against Iranian diaspora outside Iran.
Well, we're also seeing that with Russia and China being permanent, having veto powers, any such resolutions are almost destined to not go past the Security Council.
Well, that's what was the perception regarding other resolutions dealing with Iran, the terrorism issue, the nuclear issue. But I think if there is the resolve, it can be achieved.
Hmm.
They can be achieved.
So, do you think there is a red line for the European states? Is there a red line that even Iran is forced to observe? To what extent is it calibrating its actions to remain below thresholds that would trigger major diplomatic or legal consequences? I mean, we are seeing that even these mass attempted terror attacks have not been that line, and even execution of dual nationals have not been that line. Is there anything that Iran could do that would lead to such a level of popular outrage that it would force the hand of the European officials? Would it be an attack on the government institutions, a blatant act of war? Would it be a joint operation with Russia somewhere on European soil?
To be honest with you, I think the Iranian regime has passed the threshold a long time ago.
Hmm.
And it is unfortunate that Europe has been so weak and feeble in its reaction to the Iranian regime actions. And after all, we know that the Iranian regime is now supplying drones to Russia. And of course, the Ukrainian war is in the heart of Europe. So I cannot imagine the regime needing to do anything more brazen than what it has already been doing to warrant some strong and decisive action on the part of Europe. So when they've assassinated people here, they try to bomb huge gatherings here. They have tried to secure illicit equipment for the nuclear program. They have sent tens of thousands of kilograms of drugs into Europe. They've done everything. So, to be honest, I don't think there needs to be anything more dramatic for the regime to do to convince the Europeans that they must review their policy. They are completely misguided. And of course, with the level of corruption that we now see in European foreign policy institutions, as was the case a couple of weeks ago, as we saw, I'm not, of course, not so surprised. We see that the Europeans are hesitant to change their ways. But I think, quite frankly, the reality on the ground in Iran will change the situation. I think as the protests in Iran continue, as the organized opposition makes advances inside Iran, Europeans will realize that for them to have any chance at having amicable, mutually beneficial relations with the future government of Iran, then they will begin to reconsider their approach to the current regime. I remember very vividly, as you know, I was an activist under the Shah's regime in my younger days when I was a student at UCLA in Los Angeles. And I remember until the very end, the Europeans and the United States fully supported the Shah's regime. As late as in October of 1978, the British Foreign Secretary David Owen went to Iran and he said, "We fully support you," as did Hua Feng of China. But as the situation on the street changed, so did European policy, so did American policy. So I think the same thing will happen in Iran, especially so because, as I said, you have an organized nationwide opposition movement within the country and a political alternative outside the country, a government in the waiting in the form of the National Council of Resistance of Iran.
Now, here's my question. We are seeing that, there's been some high-profile cases of intimidation, attacks, and assassinations against high-profile and well-known actors. What about lesser-known actors? Is there a difference between in the way they are treated?
Well, to be honest with you, it really doesn't. Assassination attempt or harassment is all the same. And so I think there should be zero tolerance when it comes to such activities on the part of the Iranian regime. And yes, there have been some lesser known individuals kidnapped or killed for example, in the Netherlands, you had some people killed in Turkey, but I do not think that there should be, if you will, a cherry pick approach to these actions. All of them are sinister, all of them are malign, and all of them threaten the security of Europe, and the Europeans should react accordingly.
Now, to what extent do you see the role of European media in all of this? Did they help expose, or were they more likely to inadvertently amplify these intimidation campaigns?
The role of what? I didn't get the
European
question.
media, journalists.
Oh, well, of course, as you know, the Iranian regime is on record as saying that they have what they call friendly journalists who promote the idea that, yes, there's some moderates within Iran, that we should not be tough on the regime, that we should try to work with moderates. In fact, the former Iranian Minister of Intelligence under Rafsanjani, in a 2017 interview, told the Iranian television that when we send our people abroad, we don't send them to go and say, hey, I'm an intelligence agent. They pose as businessmen, they pose as journalists, and they basically carry water for us. A few years ago in Washington, a so-called expert who wrote a lot of articles against the opposition by the name of Kaveh Afrasiabi was arrested by the FBI. He had received $237,000 from the Iranian mission in the UN in New York. And as I told you about the Iranian influence operation that was unveiled in 2023, in September of 2023, where a whole host of so-called experts, academicians, who wrote a lot of articles, who produced a lot of papers, basically justifying continued appeasement of the regime and attacking and demonizing the Iranian opposition. And the regime uses those tactics, and there were also journalists like this German journalist Luisa Hommerich, who used to write for Der Spiegel and then for the German site Die Zeit, who engaged in a lot of smear articles against the Iranian opposition. So yes, you are correct that in many ways, some journalists have assisted and enhanced the policies of the regime in Europe, and have tried to sort of paint a distorted picture of the reality on the ground in Iran, that the situation is not as bad as it seems, that Iranians still support this regime, and that the organized opposition has zero support inside Iran. So it's better to deal with the devil we know. So yes, they are partly responsible for the problem that we are facing today.
Why do you suppose the newspapers and the TV channels continue to employ such people who are clearly carrying water for authoritarian regimes?
Well, for one thing, they get access to go to Iran and report from Iran. They get visas. And so for them, it's very important, you know. It sells magazines. It creates viewers when you go and stand in the streets of Tehran and report from Tehran. And so in many ways, the regime uses visa as leverage to get the kind of coverage that it wants from the Western media. That's the simple reason. I cannot explain it any other way. And of course, it also harasses journalists who are based in Iran. You know, like the families of the BBC television who were in Iran were harassed constantly by the regime in Tehran. So it's a two-way thing. One, fear factor, the other, intimidation, and of course, incentive of giving visas to journalists who write favorably for the regime.
Now, what can civil societies do to better support Iranian diasporas and activists to prevent them from to support them at the times of harassment? And to what extent do you think civil society, NGOs, and human rights organizations, think tanks have been helpful versus have been essentially either ineffectual or infiltrated?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because as we speak at the UN in Geneva, if I'm not mistaken, there are 70 so-called NGOs, but they're basically not NGO, they are gongos, which call government organization that the regime has gotten accreditation for in the UN in Geneva. And they promote the regime's line in the UN in Geneva. And they also engage in a smear campaign against the opposition at the UN. Quite a few of them. And they have these so-called very lofty names like the Organization Against Victims of Torture, the Organization in Defense of Victims of Violence, some benign cultural NGOs and things like that. So I think the civil society should speak out, name and shame these pro-regime entities in Europe, and get their accreditation canceled and expose them. That's what they can do. There's a lot they can do, and
yeah, indeed, it seems like the international communities are being turned against themselves through these methods. And unfortunately, it seems to me that it's working. So, in what ways does transnational repression undermine the concept of asylum and political refuge? After all, we are seeing a big backlash against immigration, both in the United States and Europe. We are seeing that people don't want to figure out who's the right kind of dissident and who is actually just a regime informant masquerading as one. I think, the governments don't have the resources nor the time to deal with this. The people just see it as a problem that's being exported from abroad to their own countries. So how is it that isn't to some extent Iran winning simply by causing this anti-immigration backlash against refugees and triggering this sort of populist intolerance to any kind of immigration, especially given that they you utilize foreign gangs and things and organized crime to cause even more problems?
Well, to be honest, I'm not very much into details about this issue, but there's no question that because of the actions of the regime in the Middle East, you have a lot of people who have been displaced and have come to Europe. And of course, there are a lot of problems that follow. If, for example, the situation in Syria was not the way it was, you wouldn't have millions of Syrians coming abroad. And of course, some extremist groups use that opportunity to send their folks disguised as refugees, and they come abroad and they do what they do. So I think if I were to offer a cure-all for all of this. I think once this regime is overthrown, and it will be overthrown, and you have a peaceful, democratic government in place in Iran that is willing to work with its neighbors, that is not going to interfere in their affairs, that perhaps some sense of normalcy will also return to this Europe and the situation of refugees. As you know, there are more than 4 million Iranians alone living abroad now. I suspect that once this regime is overthrown, a vast majority will want to go back and help rebuild our nation again. And so I think in that sense, the problem you see in Europe right now with the refugees and all the negative things that are happening, unfortunate things that are happening, I think is a cause of a bigger problem. And that problem, the source of that problem, is none other than the regime in Tehran.
Now, finally, we have seen that there was a moment and opportunity to put very serious pressure on Iran after its assorted proxy networks have been targeted and its defense has been degraded after its war with Israel and so forth. But now we're hearing countless voices: John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, assorted intelligence agencies, and various others reporting that Iran is aggressively trying to rebuild its military arsenal, as well as conventional military forces, as well as trying to build its nuclear program as well. And that time period that is shrinking, that opening is shrinking. Why do you suppose there hasn't been a very serious push to take advantage of that, uh, of this moment? Aside from the snapback sanctions, not much action has been taken. Iran has been essentially sidelined in favor of other security and diplomatic priorities. Do you think the international community will once again miss its chance to put serious pressure that can roll back Iranian influence?
But honestly, the Iranian problem has only an Iranian solution.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that everybody must come to terms with.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, it is the Iranian street that will make the difference. Now, unfortunately, of course, as you said, for a long time, the policy of appeasing the regime in Iran has enabled and empowered the regime in suppressing its opposition. Many years ago, even the Mujahideen was on the US, UK, and the EU terrorist list. But of course, we fought hard and we got off those lists. And of course, we gained back our legitimacy. So I think, quite frankly, that the opportunities are still there. I think the situation for the regime will not improve. They are in a downward spiral. As you said yourself, the economy is in shambles. Iran, despite the fact that it has the second largest gas reserves, it has the fourth largest oil reserves.
Mm-hmm.
It is now suffering from chronic water shortage, power shortage. Every day, people are protesting. People from all walks of life, nurses, students, people in the oil industry, farmers, physicians, you name it. Every sector of society, as we speak, are protesting. And so the mullahs have no way out. It is not the question of if, it is the question of when. But obviously, Western democracies can help expedite the process of overthrowing this regime by revisiting their policy and by stopping to engage the mullahs and instead engage the democratic opposition. But we will carry on the fight as we have done over the past 47 years. And we are as determined as ever to bring this to a situation where democracy can return to Iran and Iran can be free again. and play a constructive role in the Middle East and beyond.
Thank you so much for this insightful look into the current situation. Unfortunately, just because Iran has been weakened doesn't mean that its horrific anti-human rights campaigns have stopped. In fact, as the
Yes,
regime grows more desperate for relevance, it's actually
yes,
lashing out a lot
exactly.
more.
And like as a wounded beast, it
Hmm.
it sheds more blood, but the end will come. The will, the strength, the resilience, and the resolve of the Iranian people is far greater than whatever this regime does. Remember the famous saying uh, uh, by Victor Hugo: "No power in the world can stop an idea whose time has come."
Hmm.
The ideal of a free Iran is upon us. It will come, and let's hope we will talk again in 2026, and we will be talking in a free and democratic Iran.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Let's certainly hope for much better times in the new year. With that, thank you so much for everyone who joined us. Thank you so much to Dr. Safavi for
Thank
his
you very much. Thank you.
comments and for his insights. And let's hope the European leadership will take note and use the opportunity to secure its own citizens first of all, and also to help the process along as well. And for everyone watching, we'll be back as always next week, continuing in 2026 to have to discuss important global and national issues with diverse voices from around the world, looking past headlines and past and beyond sound bites into the depths, trying to understand and trying to gain a deep insight that will help us make wiser and more informed decisions. Thanks for everyone who joined us, and we'll be back next week again. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.